the master's program there. So I'm super excited to have her here and join us today. With that being said, I do want to do a quick bio about Dr. Christina Yao. With that being said, Christina is an associate professor of higher education at the University of South Carolina. She is a qualitative researcher who studies undergraduate and graduate student engagement and learning in higher education. She operationalized her research focus through 3 connected topical areas: international student mobility, scholar practitioner preparation, and transnational education. Dr. Yao is involved in several professional organizations, including the Association for the Study of Higher Education and the Comparative and International Education Society. She is the recipient of several awards, most recently the 2022 Innovative Research and International Education Award from NAFSA, the Association of International Education, and the 2022 NASPA Mid-Career Faculty Award. So, round of applause to Dr. Yao. Again, it is my pleasure to bring Dr. Christina Yao to the stage, and I'll hand it off to her.
Hey, thank you so much, and you can call me Christina. Please call me by my first name. Thank you so much for having me. I know this is your lunchtime, so please feel free to get up, get more food, get something more to drink, stand up, do some stretches and jumping jacks, whatever you need to do, because I promise I will not get offended, and I know it's been a lot of sitting probably this morning. So thank you for having me here today, and thank you, Andrew. Andrew and I met, I guess it was 2014, so 6 years ago, when Andrew was a very excited undergraduate student and came to Michigan State to visit. I was really excited to host him there, and very excited that 6 years later, here we are working together at UCSD. So, all right, today I'm going to talk a little bit about humanizing the international student experience. And what I'm going to do is frame that within a framework that a colleague and I developed about a year or so ago. I have the pleasure and the honor and a little bit of the misfortune to go after Dr. Jenny Lee, who is known as, a really big deal in international higher education. So, but I think what are different, you'll see a little bit of overlap in some of what we talk about, but I think what some of the differences is that I'm gonna drill down a little bit further into more institutional and more into the student experience based on some of my research. So first I want to go through a very quick roadmap of what we will talk about today. We have to really understand what's happening from a global perspective that sets up the context for international student mobility to the US. Dr. Lee did a lot of that already, so I'm going to go through some of that pretty quickly. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how Asian, Pacific Islander, and Middle Eastern international students and scholars are positioned within the current US context. However, I will say that a lot of what I'll talk about today is very relevant to all international students, but especially with a population that I would call international students of color, but we'll focus examples on the Asian, Pacific Islander, and Middle Eastern students. And then finally, talk about how an emergent equity-driven internationalization lens may lead to foregrounding equity and inequity in some of the work that we currently do in humanizing and supporting all of our international students. And I'm going to give you one caveat, right? I think sometimes in these presentations, and I do the same thing, where I want to know what can be done. Tell me exactly what to do to humanize the work that I do. How can I better support international students? And I'm going to tell you now at the very start, I'm actually not going to tell you what to do because everyone in here works in different roles on campus, in different functional areas, in different offices and everything, with very different student populations, right? Maybe you work with undergraduate students, maybe graduate students, students from all around the world. And so what I'm gonna do is just give you some considerations for you to think about as you engage with international students in your work. As a faculty member, I will do what I do best, is pose a lot of questions, right? That's what, for those of my faculty colleagues in here, we ask questions and we pose it to you for things for you to consider and to think about, all right? And so before I start, I always have to start with who I am, because I believe very strongly that reflexive practice is really in the heart of scholarship and in the work that we do, which includes research, teaching, and the service that we do. My identity and perspective is heavily influenced by my interactions. And this is actually a picture of my mother. I have to start there. My mom was an international student from British colonial Hong Kong to the United States. She ended up studying at Armstrong Atlantic State University in Savannah, Georgia, which is where where I was born and I was raised. And I remember growing up and asking my mom, I was like, how did you end up in Savannah, Georgia? Like, that's just not, that's not the typical place where many international students would choose to study. And she said she opened up the book of colleges in the United States, and Armstrong was one of the first ones listed, right? Started with an A. That's exactly how she chose it. And so I was like, oh, I would have thought there'd be a little more thought into the process and everything, but hey, it worked out. And this picture was actually taken the night before she boarded her plane to come over to the United States. That little koala bear that she's holding still in my mom's house right now and everything. And boarded the plane, came over to the US into Savannah with another student from Hong Kong to the same university. There were just two of them. My mom was very proud to be the first international student at the university, and that the president of the university actually went and picked her up from the airport. Also, funny story, my dad was also there because he immigrated to Savannah with his family, and the other student who was an international student is a family friend of my dad's family. So that's how my mom and my dad met, and this is how I ended up here in San Diego, right? So this is how all of it came together. So I grew up hearing a lot about stories of my mom's experiences growing up, or being here in the U.S. She talked a lot about how, she said that, when she went into the grocery store, into Piggly Wiggly, those of you from the Southeast know what Piggly Wiggly is, went to Piggly Wiggly, and the first time that she was able to find a bottle of soy sauce in there, that it was a really exciting time for her because she couldn't find soy sauce anywhere else and everything. So anyway, and I also grew up hearing a lot about my dad's experiences as an immigrant, right? So he immigrated here when he was about 12 years old and talked a lot about how he tried to navigate school as somebody who was non-English speaking, and his favorite story to tell was that he would sleep through class because he didn't know what the teacher was saying, and he was very proud to tell me as a young child that his teachers knew he wasn't stupid because he woke up when it was time for math and he kicked everyone's ass, is exactly what he said. So, but anyway, so both of them actually had to navigate what I would call the hidden curriculum, right, of the educational system in the United States. And we have a hidden curriculum of education. We have a hidden curriculum of even how each campus operates, right, with some of the traditions and the rituals that happen and everything. And so because of that, my interests are really based, in my experiences growing up as an Asian American woman, raised in an immigrant household that was very much affected by issues of race, language, coloniality, and belonging. Because as a reminder, my parents, when they came over, their passports were British passports and everything. So, so this, in combination with my professional background, I worked in student affairs for many, many years, mostly in residence life. It's really sparked my interest in the intersections of internationalization and global inequalities and how they directly affect students. And so in this first part, I want to talk a little bit about the context for international students and how I got to using the term international students of color, which is relevant to our conversation today. By the way, and throughout all of this, you'll see I'll put in some citations for some articles or some manuscripts that I've written. If you would like copies of them, I am happy to send them to you, so just email me, and I'm happy to send it to you so you don't have to pay the journal fees. Don't tell the journals I said that, but I'm happy to do that. So first, I think one of the biggest things we have to talk about, and I think maybe some of the context was set up, was who is an international student, right? Is to, we have to have some definitions so we can operationalize exactly who we're talking about. So throughout this presentation, when I'm talking about international students, I'm really talking about non-immigrant visitors who come to the US to take classes, right? I'm also talking about the ones who are here on an F1 visa or a J1 visa. I'll also make a little bit of mention with OPT, which I think, again, you've probably gone through some of this terminology a little bit before, but it's really important to think about what all of these are, because we throw these acronyms around. Again, right, some of this is also the hidden curriculum of maybe working in international education. We throw around F1, J1, OPT, and assume that everybody knows exactly who we're talking about, which is not always the case. So I also want to give a little bit of some historical context of international student mobility, right? We know what we see right now, and probably most recently in like the 2020, 2021, 2022, all of that. There's really been identified about 3 waves of international student mobility that took place from 1999 to 2020. That first wave was really about the demand for highly skilled workers that Dr. Lee talked about, right? About, especially with graduate education in STEM fields, that they were here to fulfill a purpose, that we need more skilled workers. The second wave was really impacted by the global financial crisis, and the interest was really in the economic benefits, right? And I also want to highlight that piece at the bottom where it says, while unprepared to support the growing international student population. Andrew mentioned that I did my doctoral work at Michigan State University, and I was at Michigan State at almost exactly the same time. And what spurred my interest in studying this population was because what I saw happening around campus was that there was a heavy, heavy push to recruit international students, especially from China, right? So when you think about like, oh, China has a lot of students, we can recruit that. They can bring a lot of money. They can bring a lot of financial benefits to us. There was a heavy push for recruitment from all parts of campus. We were talking, people from Res Life would go over to Beijing to go do a visit, right? To go with the admissions officers to go do the recruitment. People from the advising office would go there and go visit and everything. But what happened was, when I was there at that time, probably 1 in 8 first-year students were from China, which was a pretty big number, a pretty significant number. And then what everyone quickly realized was that, oh, we recruited them here, but without a lot of support and without a lot of thought to what do these students need, right? The focus was like, oh, they'll come here, they'll acclimate, they'll integrate, it'll be great, it'll be wonderful, and it'll be amazing. But then after the students arrived, everybody realized we're not doing what we need to do. So that was a big crisis at Michigan State that was heavily noted in the Chronicle of Higher Education, other news sources of, all right, you're doing all this recruitment, but what does all of this mean, right? So then the third wave that we recently coming out of was really affected by the deceleration of Chinese students. There's also Brexit, the Trump presidency in the United States, and right now in 2022, we're feeling some of the effects of that. And also, which we're all very aware of, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic as well, which is having a huge influence on what's going on and what's happening. And so that's really kind of when I continue on with my presentation, I'm going to situate it a little bit more within what I would call the start of what perhaps may be the fourth wave. So if you look at this graph, I always start with these graphs from Open Doors. The Institute of International Education, every November, they always release new data that they've collected, right, about from the previous year. To those of us who work in international education, that's like our big holiday. It's like, oh, the new numbers are going to come out, and what is it going to say? And so for many, many years, it was always, the number was continuously climbing, right? You could see exactly where I was talking about that third wave, that's where it was a pretty steep incline. And then all of a sudden, you can see a pretty big drop, right? I think we all know why there was a big drop. The Trump presidency had a huge effect on that. But it wasn't only about the anti-globalist policies of Trump. It was also the fact that there were some pretty major economic challenges all around the world, right? So a lot of different countries who would typically fund their students to come study weren't able to do so. And so that affected also the downward trend. And then obviously, as stated at the below, is that 2021, the total number declined by 15%, which is a pretty steep drop, primarily due to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're at a place right now, I'm doing a research project right now with different international educators in multiple states, including the state of California, and getting a sense of, what is the outlook right now? And that the outlook is pretty optimistic, saying that a lot of the students who chose not to come in 2021 are now choosing to come this coming year. And so the numbers are probably starting to climb again. And so that's what the outlook is right now. Again, not knowing what will happen until students actually show up on our campus in the fall. Also from IIE, this demonstrates the top states for hosting international students. And as you can see that California is one of the biggest host states. Do y'all know where UCSD ranks in all of this? Does anybody know? Did I hear something? 7th? Okay, so I'll tell you, especially because y'all are eating, so I'll let y'all keep eating. I have some questions peppered in here. I'll just answer it for you, so you can keep eating your chips and your gourmet sandwiches, as Andrew told us. USD does have the 7th highest number of enrolled international students across all research universities in the United States. You have the 2nd most in California. Do you know who you follow? USC. I call it the other USC because I'm at the original USC, right, University of South Carolina. But yes, it's the 2nd most in California, following USC. And so I also want to show you then where the majority of our students come from. So as you can see, China and India remain the largest home countries. It's been like that for many, many years, so it's not a big surprise. Also, it's not a surprise based on what your student population looks like around campus and everything. And I often show this slide because I get the question when I talk about international students of color, what do you mean by that terminology? How do you define what that means, right? As Dr. Lee said, students coming from the UK or maybe students coming from Australia, they're not getting the same types of experiences that our students maybe from East Asia, from South Asia, Southeast Asia are experiencing, right? Is because, when you look at this, 9 out of 10 countries would be considered non-predominantly white, non-predominantly Western countries, and also are non-predominantly English-speaking countries, okay? And so we also know, again, we know that students from different regions have very different experiences, mostly because of accents, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier on, about phenotype, about religion, so all of this has an influence on that. And that's how I identify international students of color within the US context, which you'll hear me talk about throughout this discussion. This actually pulled from your website. These are your top 10 countries of citizenship, which is fairly consistent with national trends, right? Some of this, I think it makes a lot of sense as far as China, India being large home countries and everything, South Korea, Hong Kong, and then also the proximity to Mexico. So not a big surprise that what the top 10 countries of citizenship are and how that reflects in your student body. Now, one thing I want to talk about a little bit also is that, in our conversations about international students, we often focus a lot on their value, right? Like even to a certain extent when we're doing this session, like how do, the value in international students and making sure they have a good experience. And when I show the slide, it's not a way of calling out NAFSA, and this is just an example, or even other higher education associations or institutions for bringing up the economic benefits of international students, but it really illustrates how common it is for us to view students as dollar signs. Right? Anytime we have any major issue that happens around the United States or on our campuses that affect international students, one of the first things that comes up is what? Like, oh, but international students are really important. They bring so much money, right? There's a lot of financial benefits and everything. Thinking about how they create jobs and they, with the money that they bring in, and also what happens, post-graduation, right? Even saying that nearly 1/4 of the founders of the $1 billion U.S. startup companies first came to America as the international students and everything. All this is doing is just illustrating how a lot of times we really view students as a commodity and how they're really dollar signs, right? And kind of lump them all together. And so Dr. Lee mentioned that this is a book chapter. I have a chapter in this book. It's actually a really great book, and I'm not making this plug just because Dr. Lee's sitting here in the corner, but it's a really good book. It's really some amazing work in there from some really great scholars, so I highly, highly recommend it. I will not send you this chapter, so for free, so buy the book. But so this, so in this chapter, what I do is I really critique the approach to viewing international students as commodities that are traded. And so it's an example of the common discourse, and in that, that they're viewed as imports and exports, right? Think about how we talk about that in our admissions offices. Right, think about how we talk about that, from high-level leadership on our campuses and everything, is that, a lot of the interest is really to help the United States maintain a global positional competition through the interest convergence of viewing students as imports and exports within the higher education market. So when you think about this, right, and especially if you think about the fact that the majority of our international students in the United States would be considered non-white, non-predominantly English-speaking, from non-Western countries, it really brings up an additional level of that dehumanization that we've seen even in our own history of the United States, right? And all of it really to serve U.S. societal and institutional interests. And so really we have a responsibility as faculty, staff, administrators to rethink our approach and conceptualization and how we position international students of color on our campuses, and how can we approach it in more humanizing ways. This was really apparent during the pandemic when enrollment went down, right? A lot of the conversation, a lot of the panic was that, what are we gonna do? We're losing a lot of students. Students can't enroll. And then we know on July 7th, 2020, right, when the SYLLABUS update came out that no international students could be fully online students, there was that additional panic of, oh my gosh, students are not going to come here, right? And so really there was a lot of that concern. And so as I continue on, and the next part, I'm actually going to go into the framework that I mentioned before, is that I'm going to situate this within these contemporary issues. So again, within what I call might be in the beginning of the fourth wave, right, affecting international student mobility. So specifically, the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of the anti-Asian sentiments, and then also with changing immigration policies. Again, this is your lunchtime. Feel free to get up, get more to drink, do whatever you need to do. So in the previous section, what I did is talked a little bit about the current context affecting international students. And now what I want to talk about is the framework that my colleague, Dr. Crystal George-Mwangi, and I created. We call it the equity-driven lens for internationalization, in which we assume that education institutions and their processes are not neutral, and thus it's important to be intentional about putting equity at the center of our practice, right? Something that I think that Dr. Lee mentioned is that a lot of times when we think about internationalization and then DEI efforts, we think of them as very, very separate entities, but they're really not, and they can't be, and they cannot continue to be. And I know that on the side of international education, I think there's a lot more recognition of that. So for example, this past spring, I went to the AIEA conference, which is all senior level international education officers, and all of the sessions all focused around how do we work on the intersection of internationalization and DEI. Okay, and so, for many, many years, when we think about internationalization, we've often talked a lot about it as being very neutral, right, as neutral endeavors, like, oh, okay, we need to internationalize, we need to globalize. But internationalization is never neutral, and it always includes some kind of a power dynamic. All right, so here's the framework, and so we created this framework to illustrate the complicated network of internationalization, right? So I'm not sure even on this campus, but on multiple campuses that I've been on, we often talk a lot about, oh, we need to be more global in what we do. We need to internationalize, but it's not very clear what that really means. Right? So again, did my doctoral work at Michigan State, and I think Andrew can attest to this, is that Michigan State always said, we're very global, and talked even about, we're no longer just a land-grant university, we're a world-grant university, right? But nobody could really clearly articulate, what does that really, really mean? And so when we created this framework, we sat there, we went through a lot of literature and developed this image that hopefully is helpful in kind of conceptualizing this, is that what you see in the middle is what we call a piece of yarn, right, which we use as a metaphor for illustrating the internationalization of higher education. And now when we think about yarn, right, whether you're knitting a sweater, you're knitting a scarf, whatever you're able to do, is that yarn is usually viewed as one thread, right, a singular piece of thread. Just the same way that internationalization is often thought about as a single broad umbrella term that can really overshadow its complexity. But when you look closer and we use that lens to illuminate that, the yarn is actually really made up of multiple strands of tightly interlocked fibers, right? So those of you, again, who use yarn for any crafting or if you knit, if you start like pulling apart a piece of yarn, there's multiple strands of fibers that are interlocked together and everything. And so in our argument, we say that internationalization also reflects the interconnectedness of multiple complex processes, policies, practices, people, communities, and organizations, okay? So for the purpose of our conversation today, our focus is really on like one little piece of that yarn, so really about international student mobility. You also see at the very top what we call the equity-driven lens. We have four guiding principles that guide how we approach internationalization. And on this next slide, I actually placed them on the slide for easier readability. And what we're going to do for the rest of this is actually go a little bit deeper into those four guiding principles, okay? What we argue is that applying an equity-driven lens to internationalization requires unpacking the underlying conceptual theoretical perspectives. We have to deconstruct and then reconstruct internationalization. We need to identify the socio-historical context, and we have to connect to the contemporary forces of globalization. That in doing all of this, we have to think about all these four pieces together. And so I'm going to discuss and show the application of the framework to our topic today about international students, particularly those from Asian, Pacific Islander, and Middle Eastern countries. So for the first lens, I'm going to talk a little bit about defining the socio-historical context, all right? And so with thinking about the socio-historical context, we know that the US has been a site of internationalization, globalization, colonization, and the domination of people, land, and ideas. We still do that, right now. And current institutional practices cannot be divorced from social and historical events and ideologies that continue to inform contemporary approaches to international education, research, policy, and practice. So we can pursue equitable approaches by considering socio-historical context context, and how these contexts serve as foundation for our current practices and strategies on our campuses. In doing this, we can approach our work with international students in a way that interrogates how prior actions and the ideology of U.S. higher education permeates what we do, right? We have to understand what did we do in the past to know how that affects what we're doing right now. We also have to recognize that our students arrive on our campuses and are thrust into a new social context, right? That's really based on a lot of our history, thus necessitating that we recognize that we have a hidden curriculum on our campuses and our local communities. Okay, one of the biggest ways that I see this on my own campus, the University of South Carolina, is that we're having a lot of conversations right now about the naming of our buildings. They're named after several, I guess what we could call Confederate leaders who have questionable perspectives. And so, there's a lot of conversation about changing that. But how much are we talking to our international students and scholars about the historical pieces of that, right? Of making sure that they feel engaged and that there's an understanding of what's going on and what's happening. So now I'm going to go through a few examples, right, to exemplify, why we need to talk about the socio-historical perspective. My first example connects to the Asian history in the United States, which began with the arrival of Chinese and Japanese immigrants, mostly for labor reasons, and then settling on the West Coast, right? Their arrival, not a big surprise to anybody who knows a little bit of history, is that caused significant racism and hostility from white Americans at that time due to perceived employment competition, right? Which is, again, something that Dr. Lee had talked about, that a lot of politicians would talk about that, oh no, there's employment competition, we're blaming the immigrants, right? We're blaming the people here that don't belong and stuff. So, ultimately, Asian people in the United States represented the yellow peril, which refers to the fear and mistrust of Asian individuals that really categorize Asians as forever foreigners, right? Again, that conversation of where are you from? Now, where are you really from, right? Those kind of questions that are, even for me, I constantly get. And so Asians have often been identified as being unable to assimilate and cause competition, disease, and immorality. And we've seen this happen in recent years, right? We saw it with the SARS outbreak in 2003. We saw the immorality piece with the shootings in Atlanta, right? That the shooter blamed the workers in there for immorality reasons and everything. And then most recently in the COVID-19 pandemic. Another example I want to talk about that greatly affects our student population we're talking about is that there's always been a lot of contention around migration and immigration in U.S. history. Again, starting with settler colonialism and the displacement of indigenous peoples. So immigration policies have often been very contentious, they've been divisive, and they've been very discriminatory, starting with the Naturalization Act of 1970. And so despite romanticized slogans such as the United States being a land of immigrants, which we all know is somewhat untrue, right? It's not fully a land of immigrants, it's really, also a land of settler colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. The reality is that immigration and migration debates often perpetuate stereotypes, create an us versus them mentality against perceived outsiders, and sparked increased racist nativism. And so overall immigration policies have always served as a tool to control who belongs to the United States, which is a chronic issue since the establishment of the country. And we've also seen that that exemplified in the past couple of years, right? That, when we think about immigration policies, when we think about, even the SYLLABUS update in July 2020, we've seen this come up over and over again in our history and everything. And so also, what I've also included in each of these sections are some quotations from interviews that I've done with different international students for different projects and everything. This is from a recent project where I was talking to international graduate students and trying to get a sense of what it's like for them in the classroom. And this was a quotation from a student who said that, she gets the feeling that one of her teachers likes Americans more. And I thought it was a great quotation to highlight that us versus them dynamic that our students may experience in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom too. That the perspectives of racist nativism, right, and also of deciding who belongs and who doesn't, may permeate our international students' experiences in the classroom. And so what I would ask, again, I told you, right, as a faculty member, what I do best is ask a lot of questions. So this is a question for you to think about is, how might the socio-historical context of your university, your local community, and the U.S. society impact your ability to infuse justice and equity into your work? Right? You have to think about, what is it, what's going on here at UCSD, right? What's the historical perspectives here? How about the local community of San Diego and everything, right? Also, we talked a lot about the larger US society and everything, but how does that impact the work that you do and impact the experiences of our students on campus? All right, moving on to the second lens. It's connecting to contemporary forces of globalization. And in this second lens, right, what we're asking for you to consider is to think about the global structures and systems that privilege the needs of what is considered the global north, as outlined by Dr. Lee in the previous presentation. This is really relevant today because we often think about, that U.S. domestic priorities are disconnected from global issues, which is simply untrue, right? We know that what happens around the world affects us locally, and we saw this with the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the most recent example of this. Thus, all educators on campus must take into consideration how contemporary forces of globalization that are affected by economics, about power, about difference and everything, and interrogate how local and world events, with an emphasis on economic and political factors, may affect the work that we do. And so in this example, right, when we think about the forces of globalization, we've seen so many iterations of policies and laws that affect multiple people on our campuses. And specifically, I want to talk about how these laws may have affected international students on our campus, leading to feelings of trauma and insecurity, right? So even in the past 2 years, we've seen an expansion of travel bans from predominantly Muslim countries a few years ago. So in January 2020, a policy was later rescinded that, again, international students could not come study in the US and remain as fully online students. And so we've had proclamations in effect, even as late as January 2021 about suspended entries from certain countries, right, that were relatively arbitrarily decided. And so now we're kind of moving out of those extensive visa delays that permeated worldwide last fall. And we also always know that it's easier for some students from particular countries to get visas, thus, again, bringing up that chronic question of who belongs and who can come to the United States. So that intersection of that socio-historical perspective along with globalization. So here's another research participant who talked about feelings related to job insecurity as well as who belongs and who doesn't, right? This was specifically talking to students, again, a graduate student, about what it's like to be here as a student, especially within the contention of the past 2 years. So things about, what have they been feeling about like the visa policies? How about with all the, even questions about like the Black Lives Matter movement, and how they feel their role is with that and everything. And so, this is an example of how, globalization affects a lot of the things that affect our students. Even, for example, the most recent expansion of OPT, right? We expanded to multiple STEM fields, expanded from 1 year to 3 years, right? But really the purpose, as always, is to compete globally, right? As in, we can decide who can stay for the purposes of national interest. And then connecting back to my previous slide about the yellow peril as a socio-historical perspective, we've seen these global issues, the effects of globalization with the pandemic. We've seen that there's increased or more visibility of racism against Asian-presenting individuals. We have to think about how many of our Asian-identified students, both domestic and international, have had to navigate discriminatory remarks from people, right? Or about even the fear of early on, right now it's common that we're all wearing masks, but earlier on, right, it tends to be more of our Asian international students that were wearing masks, right? And then the scapegoating and the stereotyping that they might experience and everything like that. So overall, anti-Asian sentiments have been rampant across the globe throughout the pandemic, a lot of it really rooted in chronic anti-Asian discrimination. So this is another quotation from a student who shared their experiences shopping in Target early on in the pandemic. This was in a focus group, and a student who identifies as being an East Asian international student was talking about how, they literally were just shopping in Target, and some people approached them and said, "Stop spreading the virus," and everything. And I think what's most poignant in this quotation is one, not even that there were these discriminatory comments against them, but also they said, it's so frustrating that this happened in public and there were other people around and nobody said anything about this, right? And then also that the student said, "I wanted to report this, but my friend stopped me because she thought no one would believe me." And that random people attack Asian students knowing that we would not take revenge. Again, something that Dr. Lee had talked about, that very few students tend to report these issues, right? Because fear of, retaliation, of not being believed, right? So we have to think about how do we communicate with our students about how to report these situations when they do come up, or what support can we offer on our campuses. And so the question that I would pose to you when you think about the effects of globalization is how do local and world events affect international students' experiences on and off our campuses, right? So even, for example, when I talked before about the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black Lives Matter movement was not isolated just to the United States, right? It's been going on for many years, but we've also seen it happen, it's moved around the whole world and everything. But what does that mean, right? What does that mean for our Black international students who come to campus and how they may be perceived? I have one student that I interviewed a couple of years ago. It's from Rwanda, and in talking to him, I asked, why did you choose to come here despite some of the many challenges, the barriers that you've identified to me? And they said, well, it's still an opportunity because getting an education in the United States is still the top education in the world, so it's worth it. He goes, even though my mom is scared to death that I'm gonna go home with a bullet in my head because I'm a Black man. Right? And so, so to me, I think it's a very interesting situation like that where you're still choosing to come here, yet you already know that it's already a very dangerous situation. So what can we do as administrators, staff, and faculty to help mitigate some of that? And so our next lens is about deconstructing and constructing internationalization. And so we really have to think about how we conceptualize, deconstruct, and then reconstruct internationalization, right? We have to think beyond these implicit assumptions of internationalization and engage in greater nuance. The overarching idea is for us to question who gets to decide what counts and who counts on an individual campus rather than accept the status quo, what's included, excluded, or defined. You'll notice that so far I've had no examples about Pacific Islander students, and it's not because I did not try to find examples. It is literally because, embarrassingly enough, this population, Pacific Islander international students, is not a consideration in international higher education. Apparently the numbers are so small that they become aggregated into other. Right? Also, possibly because of location, a large number of Pacific Islander students tend to go study in Australia, which, a little further to come here to the United States, right? And then also, this is where we go a little bit into US policy and US history and the effects of colonization, is that because several are also US territories, many of our Pacific Islander students might come here to study and be considered domestic students. We also know that one size does not fit all, and that a sole focus on national identity is that it silences students' other social locations, such as socioeconomic status, their religious identity, their ethnic identity, linguistic background, sexuality, ability, and other identities. And so in thinking about how do we deconstruct internationalization, and in not thinking about international students as one monolithic group, how do we kind of break that down and disaggregate the student population so we can better support their needs? So as an example, I want to highlight places of origin of international students. Again, this is from Open Doors. These are their 2021 Fast Facts. We often lump international students together into one homogeneous population, but students come from all over. And so for the purpose of our conversation today, you can see that most of our students come from Asia with 67.5%, a smaller percentage from the Middle East of 4.2%, and then, like I mentioned, students from the Pacific Islands don't even appear on this list, and my guess, again, is that they're lumped into the other group, okay? We also need to do better, right, when we think about disaggregating the needs of disaggregating between our undergraduate and graduate students. So here at UCSD, do you know what your breakdown is for your population for your undergraduate and graduate? People are kind of looking around. Okay, so I'll tell you because I looked this up. So international students who are undergraduate students make up about 16 to 17% of the undergrad population, okay? But international students make up 40% of the graduate population, so a pretty significant number. Not a surprise, right? When we look at the history of international student mobility, it really started more with graduate students. And so how often do we really think about their different needs? So even in our conversation, that we're talking about today, a lot of times when we talk about international students or using that as a population, we make the assumption that we're talking about undergraduate students, right? But we also know that graduate students have very, very different needs. Several of them might come here with their partners and spouses. Some people might bring family members, right? They have to think about putting their children in US schools. They have to think about the fact that their spouses may be prohibited from working. And so what kind of support can faculty and administrators and staff also give to families of international students, right? That is the population that is very, very, underserved, understudied, and we often never talk about that. But when we talk about even here, who are members of our UCSD community and how do we embrace, beyond just the student, but also the student's family and everything? Because our responsibility is not just the student, it's also to the families who are here with them. So this is a slide I also pulled from your website, right? Again, not a surprise that China and India are your top home countries. Really follows national trends and everything, but it has some important implications based on our conversations, right? That when you think about it and when you look at this, the larger number of Asian students almost makes it easier to focus on their needs. You know, that we can say like, oh, we have a large population of Asian students, we can just do all of this stuff for our Asian students. But we also still need to disaggregate within that, right? That there's many cultural and linguistic differences between East Asian, Southeast Asian, and not to mention that even within one particular region, there are political and historical nuances that we have to be aware of. For example, when we talk about China or we talk about Taiwan, like there's a very contentious relationship there when we look at that. Again, we don't see Pacific Islander students here at all. Again, I think it might be in the other population, which contributes to the erasure of this population. And then also very few Middle Eastern students appear on this list, which means that they can be further marginalized, yet we know that different global and local events affect students differently. Again, no Pacific Islanders on this list, which again, I tried very, very hard to find them, so. Quick quotation here is from a doctoral student, that the issues of finances at a university are especially concerning to graduate students who rely on funding from different departments, right, based on their teaching or their research assistantships. So this really illustrates the need to get to the nuances and the needs of differing student populations. So how do we help our students when they seek jobs post-graduation? Do we take into consideration the limitations that they may have for employment and if they have spouses and family members with them? And so what I'd like for you to think about, related to this lens is how does your university disaggregate the needs of international student populations to better support them? I think this symposium is already a really great start, that the emphasis is on Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern students, right? But are we also talking about our students from Africa, students from South America? So really disaggregating the different needs that our students may have. All right, I promise I'm getting to our final lens, which is about integrating equity-driven conceptual and theoretical perspectives. And in this, we have to think about, again, that internationalization is not values neutral. We see that on many campuses, even that push for more global mindedness or for global citizenship in our students. But what does that really mean, and who's even excluded from these conversations, especially when the idea of citizenship is so contested, right? So one way that we can do this is think about for ourselves, conceptually and theoretically, what is our perspective that enables us to critique and disrupt inequity and marginalization that occurs, and then also identify and engage in resistance of that, right? To reimagine how we can do our work with our student populations. And so in the next few examples, I'm going to go through these really quickly because I know we're running out of time. These are based on some of my current research where I take more of an analysis on institutional and societal structures in place. And so moving beyond simply noting student experiences, right? If you look at current research and you look a lot at current practices that are happening, the focus has been a lot on what are student experiences, right? The individual experiences, which is very, very important, but we have to situate that within the specific context and systems that affect their overall experiences, because we have to shift the onus of responsibility away from the students to the institution. Okay? That is one thing that I think we're not doing well enough, is that a lot of times we think about students, you've got to integrate, you've got to, assimilate and all that, but what we really have to do is take that onus of responsibility away. And so this is just a very quick example of how, in an article that I co-wrote with some colleagues, is that we argued that critical race theory, which I'm assuming is okay to say in California, it's not okay for me to say in South Carolina or anywhere else in the southern states. As you know, there's been the CRT bans that have been happening and everything, but we argued that we could use CRT to analyze this because of its emphasis on countering systems of white supremacy and claims of meritocracy, and that affects the lives of international students of color on predominantly white campuses. And so adding those critical lenses, right, so we can investigate what these privileged positioning of white American values and really push against the assumptions of assimilation and acculturation in our international students. And then another very recent example of an article, Yellow Peril and Cash Cows, of using a critical framework, we analyzed how East Asian international students are positioned within current discourse, particularly within COVID-19, using racist nativism and group positioning theory. And what we found is that they were simultaneously positioned as scapegoats, bearers of disease, cash cows, and political pawns, all within about a year of the COVID-19 pandemic and everything, right? They were blamed for the pandemic, they're blamed for the disease, they're cash cows that bring economic benefits, and also they were being used as political pawns a lot of times to force institutions to reopen their campuses in the wake of shifting immigration policies. And so these two papers are just some quick examples of how to take a broader organizational approach to examining the policies and practices using a more critical, conceptual, analytical frame. And so again, my question for you to think about is, how does my theoretical or conceptual perspective help me to foreground equity in who or what my practice serves and centers? All right, I very quickly went through those 4 lenses. I also know that I am standing between you and maybe a quick break and everything after what I hope was a very delicious lunch and everything. But I wanted to show this slide again, right? Is again to think about that even when we talk about supporting international students of color on our campus as one little strand of the yarn, there's also multiple pieces that kind of go together, right? So thinking about how do we integrate some of this work in when our students go study abroad? How do we integrate some of this work when we think about, you know, the international partnerships that we have, because that affects all of our students on our campuses and everything. Okay? And so what I have here are just some considerations for practice, right? And going through all of this and having talked at you for about 40 minutes is, you know, these are some questions for your department, your organization, or your institution to think about. How do you talk about students in more humanizing ways? Can you avoid leading with economic benefits when discussing their importance to campus? So how do we avoid essentializing our students to one homogeneous group? You know, whose experiences are centered and who's ignored in these discussions, right? I mentioned multiple times, it was really, really hard to find data about our Pacific Islander students on campus. And so what does that mean? And how can we better focus on those students to make sure that these students' needs are centered and not ignored, right? We also need to really think about what are the larger structures, systems, values, and histories that internationalization practices are embedded within, and also how do we work in practices where we can resist, you know, these hegemonic discourses or practices in our work and everything. Okay, 106. I went a little bit over, so I don't know if we have time for questions or if you want to do.
Test. Awesome. Thank you. Give a round of applause to Dr. Christina Yao one more time. Thank you very much. So to be mindful of time, we probably have time for 1 or 2 questions for Dr. Christina Yao. We also have a follow-up session with Dr. Christina Yao after this, so if you want to, you're more than welcome to stay here. But is there a burning question for the entire audience? Going once, going twice. Awesome. Thank you very much. So I do want to say one more time, thank you, Dr. Christina Yao. We appreciate you being here today and sharing your framework with us. Again, for those, if you are interested in learning more and having more discussion with Christina today, please stay in the ballroom. But as you may know, for today, if we can switch to the other slide. We are now beginning the day with some of the smaller sessions, breakout sessions. So you're welcome to take a picture if you like. There is a paper version outside the ballroom that you can take a picture as well. We're going to jump into some of our small breakout sessions. As you can see, we have a follow-up with Dr. Christina Yao after this, an international student alumni experience panel in the Red Shoe Room, and continue on throughout the day. We hope that you do come back at 4 o'clock so we can close out and prep for day 2. But with that being said, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day in these very small sessions, learn more, some from our students, some from other staff members, and that's pretty much it. So thank you very much.